Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the theories, revolutions, rat mazes, lever presses, cognitive maps, and occasional academic shouting matches that shape the field. Today, behaviorism grows up. It gets more technical. It gets more mathematical. It meets Skinner. It tries very hard to keep the mind out of psychology. And then Gestalt psychology yells from across the room, "You are missing the whole." In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline. We are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time, Watson stormed in and told psychology to stop studying consciousness and focus only on observable behavior. He wanted psychology to become an objective natural science based on stimulus and response. Today, we follow what happened after Watson. Behaviorism does not stay exactly the same. It evolves. And by the end of this episode, psychology is moving toward a world where behavior still matters, but internal organization, expectation, perception, problem solving, and cognition are forcing their way back into the conversation. Very politely in some cases, very aggressively in others. Part 1. What neo-behaviorists agreed on Watson's behaviorism was the first major stage in the behavioral school of thought. It was bold, dramatic, and revolutionary, but it was also incomplete. The second stage is called Neobehaviorism, and it lasted roughly from 1930 to 1960. This stage includes major figures such as Edward Tolman, Clark Hull, and B.F. Skinner. The neo-behaviorists did not all agree with one another. In fact, some of their systems were very different. But they did share several broad assumptions. First, they agreed that the core of psychology should be the study of learning. Second, they believed that most behavior, no matter how complex, could be explained by the laws of conditioning. Third, they argued that psychology should adopt the principle of operationism. That last one is especially important. Operationism becomes one of the defining features of neo-behaviorism. Then, after neo-behaviorism, we get a third stage in behaviorism's development. This stage is sometimes called neo-behaviorism or socio-behaviorism, and it lasted roughly from 1960 to 1990. This stage includes figures such as Albert Bandura and Julian Rotter. What makes socio-behaviorism different is that it brings cognitive processes back into the picture while still maintaining a focus on observable behavior. That return matters. It shows behaviorism bending toward the very questions that cognitive psychologists would later place at the center of the field. How do organisms interpret situations? How do they anticipate outcomes? How do they learn from observation? How do internal expectations guide action? So today's episode is not just about behaviorism becoming stronger, it is also about behaviorism becoming unstable. Because once psychologists start talking about goals, expectations, maps, and internal variables, the mind is already halfway back in the room. Part 2. Operationalism. Define it or don't use it. Let's start with operationism, sometimes called operationalism. The purpose of operationism was to make the language of science more objective and precise. It was also meant to rid science of what some called pseudo-problems. A pseudo-problem is a problem that cannot actually be observed, measured, or physically demonstrated. From this point of view, if a concept cannot be tied to observable operations, then it does not belong in science. Operationism holds that the validity of a scientific finding or theoretical construct depends on the validity of the operations used to arrive at that finding. In simpler terms, tell me exactly how you measured it. Tell me exactly what you did. Tell me exactly what counts as evidence. If you cannot define the operation, do not pretend the concept is scientific. For neo-behaviorists, this was appealing because it seemed to make psychology cleaner and more objective. A concept like private conscious experience was treated as a pseudo-problem. Why? Because consciousness could not be directly observed by another person. Its existence, structure, and characteristics could not be investigated by fully objective methods. So, from an operationist viewpoint, consciousness had no place in a scientific psychology. Now, critics argued that operationism was not really new. They said psychologists were already defining concepts in relation to measurable operations. The long-term trend in American psychology had already been moving toward greater objectivity in both method and subject matter. So operationism may have simply formalized what many psychologists were already doing. But once physicists accepted operationism as a formal doctrine, many psychologists felt pressure to follow their lead. And interestingly, psychologists eventually used operationism even more extensively than physicists did. By the late 1920s and 1930s, the generation of neo-behaviorists coming into psychology, including Skinner, incorporated operationism into their work. That means psychology was not only asking, what do we study? It was asking, how do we define what we study? What counts as evidence? What kinds of concepts are allowed? What kinds of concepts are too vague to survive? This is psychology trying to police its own scientific language. Part 3. Tolman's Purposive Behaviorism. Now we turn to Edward Chase Tolman. Tolman's approach is known as purposive behaviorism, and he presented it in his book Purposive Behavior in Animals and Men. At first glance, that phrase may sound contradictory. Purpose and behaviorism? A behaviorist talking about purpose? Suspicious, but Tolman was not trying to bring back vague mentalism or introspection. He was a behaviorist in subject matter and methodology. He rejected introspection. He was not interested in private internal experiences that could not be studied objectively. But Tolman believed that purposiveness in behavior could be defined in objective behavioral terms. In other words, he thought we could study goal-directed behavior without asking people or animals to introspect about how they felt. Tolman believed all actions are goal-directed. He famously said that behavior reeks of purpose. Behavior for Tolman is oriented toward achieving goals or learning the means to an end. Think of a rat running a maze. Strict behaviorists might describe the rat's behavior as a chain of stimulus-response connections. Tolman thought that was not enough. The rat appears to be going somewhere. It behaves as if it has learned something about the layout of the environment. It behaves as if it is pursuing a goal. Tolman wanted to study that purposiveness scientifically. Part 4. Tolman's Variables and the Organism. Tolman dealt with objective responses. His measurements focused on changes in behavior as a function of learning. He believed that the causes of behavior and the final resulting behavior must be capable of objective observation and operational definition. Tolman identified 5 independent variables as causes of behavior: environmental stimuli, physiological drives, heredity, previous training, and age. He argued that behavior is a function of these 5 variables and even expressed the idea mathematically. But Tolman also introduced something extremely important: intervening variables. Intervening variables are internal processes that connect the stimulus situation with the observed response. This changes the simple behaviorist formula. Instead of SR, or stimulus response, Tolman moved toward SOR, stimulus, organism, response. The O matters. It represents whatever is going on within the organism that helps produce the behavioral response to a stimulus situation. Now, there is a problem. Intervening variables cannot be directly observed. So how can a behaviorist use them? Tolman's answer was operationism. Intervening variables are useful only if they can be directly related to observable independent variables and observable behavioral outcomes. For example, consider hunger. Hunger is internal. We cannot directly observe the subjective feeling of hunger in a rat. But hunger can be operationally defined. It can be related to an experimental variable, such as the number of hours since the organism last received food. It can also be related to behavioral variables, such as how much food is eaten or how quickly the organism runs toward food. So even though hunger is internal, it can be described precisely in relation to empirical variables. It can be quantified. It can be experimentally manipulated. That means Tolman could talk about internal states without abandoning scientific control. This is why Tolman matters so much for cognitive psychology. He did not simply drag psychology back into vague talk about the mind. He opened a controlled door. He made it possible to talk about internal representations, expectations, goals, and cognitive maps while still demanding observable evidence. In that sense, Tolman helps build a bridge from strict behaviorism to the later cognitive revolution. The mind could come back into psychology, but it had to bring data with it. Part 5. Hull's four methods. Next, we meet Clark Hull. Hull's behaviorism was mechanistic, reductionistic, and objective. He wanted behavior to be studied with the precision of the natural sciences. For Hull, methods had to be objective and quantitative. The fundamental laws of behavior should be expressed in the precise language of mathematics. Hull identified four methods that he considered useful for scientific research. The first three were already widely used: simple observation, systematic, controlled observation, and experimental testing of hypotheses. The fourth was the method Hull emphasized most strongly: the hypothetico-deductive method. This method begins with a set of postulates or formulations determined in advance. From those postulates, researchers deduce conclusions that can be tested experimentally. If the conclusions are not supported by evidence, the theory must be revised. If the conclusions are supported and verified, they may be incorporated into science. Hull believed that if psychology were to become truly objective, like the natural sciences, then the hypothetico-deductive method was the proper route. This was behaviorism at its most formal and theoretical. Where Watson had been bold and polemical, Hull wanted a precise scientific system. He wanted psychology to look mathematically rigorous. Part 6. Why Tolman and Hull matter. Tolman and Hull mattered for different reasons. Tolman is often recognized as a forerunner of contemporary cognitive psychology. His research on learning and his concept of the intervening variable had a major impact. He made learning look less like a simple chain of stimulus-response habits and more like a process involving goals, expectations, and mental organization. Intervening variables gave psychologists a way to operationally define internal states. That made internal states more respectable as topics for scientific study. Tolman also strongly supported the use of the white rat as a psychological research subject. Thanks to Tolman and other neo-behaviorists, the white rat became the primary research subject for learning theorists from about 1930 to the 1960s. Researchers assumed that studying white rats could reveal basic processes underlying the behavior of rats, other animals, and humans. Hull, meanwhile, became one of the leading defenders of neo-behaviorism. He was criticized by psychologists who opposed behaviorism generally, but his influence was still substantial. His system can be criticized for lacking generalizability. Because he tried to define variables so precisely and quantitatively, he often worked on a narrow plane. Sometimes he formulated broad claims from results obtained in a single experiment. That extreme precision limited how widely his findings could apply. But Hull inspired an enormous amount of research. He influenced many psychologists, and he defended, extended, and explained the objective behaviorist approach more systematically than anyone before him. So Tolman and Hull show two different directions within neo-behaviorism. Tolman moved behaviorism toward cognitive variables. Hull moved behaviorism toward formal theory and mathematical prediction. Both changed the field. Part 7. Skinner. Operant conditioning and consequences now. We come to B.F. Skinner. Where Hull emphasized theory, Skinner emphasized empirical description. Skinner did not want a grand theoretical framework. He wanted to describe behavior. He wanted to establish functional relationships between experimentally controlled stimulus conditions and the organism's responses. Skinner's behaviorism was devoted to the study of responses. He was concerned with observable behavior. He was not interested in speculating about what might be happening inside the organism. His program did not rely on intervening variables, drives, internal entities, or physiological processes. Whatever might happen between stimulus and response was not the kind of objective data Skinner wanted to study. For that reason, Skinner's approach has often been called the empty organism approach. Now, Skinner did not deny that internal physiological or mental conditions exist. That point matters. He was not necessarily saying there is nothing inside the organism. He was saying that those internal events were not useful for a scientific analysis of behavior. For Skinner, human organisms are controlled by forces in the environment, not by inner mental causes. The scientific task is to understand how environmental contingencies shape behavior. Part 9. The Skinner box. Skinner disliked the term Skinner box. That phrase was first used by Clark Hull in 1933. Skinner preferred the term operant conditioning apparatus. But history has spoken, and Skinner box is what stuck. In the classic setup, a food-deprived rat is placed in the apparatus and allowed to explore. Eventually, by accident, the rat presses a lever or bar. That lever activates a mechanism that releases a food pellet onto a tray. After receiving a few food pellets, the rat usually begins pressing the lever more rapidly. The food pellet serves as a reinforcer. The dependent variable is simple and direct: the rate of response. From this basic experiment, Skinner developed his law of acquisition. The law of acquisition states that the strength of an operant behavior increases when it is followed by a reinforcing stimulus. Practice can matter because it creates opportunities for reinforcement. But practice alone does not increase responding. Reinforcement is the key variable. Skinner's approach differs from Thorndike and Hull. Thorndike talked about satisfaction and discomfort in the law of effect. Hull interpreted reinforcement in terms of drive reduction. Skinner did neither. He did not explain reinforcement in terms of pleasure, pain, satisfaction, dissatisfaction, or drive reduction. His system was descriptive, not explanatory. If a consequence increases the rate of behavior, it functions as reinforcement. That is Skinner's style. Do not speculate, describe the functional relation. Part 10. Skinner's legacy and criticisms. Skinner's behaviorism was extremely influential, but it was also criticized. One major criticism concerned his extreme positivism and opposition to theory. Critics argued that it is impossible to eliminate all theorizing. Even planning an experiment involves assumptions. Choosing variables involves assumptions. Accepting conditioning principles as the basis for research involves theory. So critics argued that Skinner was more theoretical than he admitted. Another criticism involved Skinner's willingness to apply his system to broad social issues. He made confident claims about economic, social, political, and religious problems based on his behaviorist principles. In 1986, he wrote an article called "What is Wrong with Life in the Western World?" In it, he argued that human behavior in the West had grown weak and could be strengthened through principles derived from the experimental analysis of behavior. Critics saw this as inconsistent with his anti-theoretical stance. If Skinner rejected broad speculation, how could he confidently propose solutions to complex human problems? That said, Skinner's influence was enormous. From the 1950s to the 1980s, he was the uncontested champion of behavioral psychology. American psychology during that period was shaped more by Skinner than by any other psychologist. In 1958, the APA awarded Skinner the Distinguished Scientifics Contribution Award, noting that few American psychologists had had such a profound impact on psychology and on younger psychologists. Skinner's overall goal was the betterment of human life and society through the application of behavioral principles. Despite the mechanistic nature of his system, he was a humanitarian. He wanted behavior analysis to reduce human suffering. He believed it could improve homes, schools, businesses, and institutions. He became increasingly frustrated that his ideas, though popular and influential, were not applied more widely or wisely, so Skinner is another complicated historical figure. Mechanistic, yes, anti-theoretical, at least in his own description, but also deeply committed to using psychology to improve human life. Part 11, Bandura, Rotter, and Social Learning. Now we move into the third stage of behaviorism, socio-behaviorism, also called Neobehaviorism. This stage includes Albert Bandura and Julian Rotter. Bandura, Rotter, and their followers were still behaviorists in important ways. They valued observable behavior. They valued controlled methods. They valued learning. But their behaviorism was quite different from Skinner's. They questioned Skinner's rejection of mental and cognitive processes. Instead, they proposed social learning approaches that reflected the broader cognitive movement happening in psychology. Social learning theories mark the third stage in the development of the behaviorist school. Bandura's theory, along with the modeling therapy derived from it, fit the practical and functional style of American psychology. His approach was objective. It could be studied in the laboratory. It was responsive to the intellectual climate that increasingly emphasized internal cognitive variables, and it could be applied to real-world issues. Bandura showed that people can learn by observing others. That is a major shift. Learning does not always require direct reinforcement. We can watch, interpret, remember, anticipate, imitate, adjust. That brings cognition back into learning. Rotter emphasized cognitive processes even more strongly than Bandura. Rotter believed we experience ourselves as conscious beings capable of influencing the events that affect our lives. Behavior is shaped by external stimuli and reinforcement, but these influences are mediated by cognitive processes. Rotter's social learning theory attracted many experimentally oriented followers who agreed that cognitive variables influence behavior. His research was rigorous and controlled, and he defined concepts precisely enough for experimental testing. One of his most important concepts was locus of control. Locus of control refers to whether people tend to perceive outcomes as controlled internally by their own actions or externally by outside forces. Rotter claimed that locus of control became one of the most studied variables in psychology and the social sciences. So by this stage, behaviorism has changed. It is no longer simply stimulus-response behaviorism. It now includes expectation, observation, interpretation, modeling, and perceived control. The mind is coming back, but now it is coming back through behavior, measurement, and experimental research. Part 12. The Gestalt Revolution. At about the same time behaviorism was gaining strength in the United States, a different revolution was unfolding in Germany. This was the Gestalt Revolution. Gestalt psychology was another protest against Wundtian psychology, and that point matters. Wundt's ideas were so important that multiple schools formed by arguing against him. Behaviorism attacked Wundt's focus on consciousness. Gestalt psychology attacked Wundt's elementism. Gestalt psychologists were especially critical of the idea that psychological experience could be broken down into sensory elements. Wolfgang Kohler, one of the founders of Gestalt psychology, said that he and others had been shocked by the idea that psychological facts consisted of unrelated inert atoms, combined mainly by association. Gestalt psychologists rejected that. They argued that experience comes organized. It comes in patterns, wholes, configurations. The word Gestalt is often translated as form, pattern, or configuration. To understand why this mattered, think about psychology around 1912. Watson's behaviorism was beginning its attack on Wundt, Titchener, and functionalism. Animal research from Thorndike and Pavlov was influencing the field. Freud's psychoanalysis was already more than a decade old, and Gestalt psychology emerged as another major alternative. Although Gestalt psychology and behaviorism both opposed Wundtian elementism, they were independent movements, and eventually they opposed each other too. Behaviorists rejected consciousness as useful for scientific psychology. Gestalt psychologists accepted consciousness but rejected the attempt to reduce it to atoms or elements. Part 13. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. The central Gestalt idea is often summarized this way. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. Notice the wording, not just greater than, different from. If you combine individual musical notes, you can get a melody. But the melody is not contained in any single note. It emerges from the pattern or relationship among the notes. The whole has a quality that cannot be found in the isolated parts. Gestalt psychologists argued that perception works this way. When sensory elements combine, they form a new pattern or configuration. You do not experience disconnected fragments first and then build them into a world. You experience organized wholes. Now, in fairness to Wundt, he did recognize something like this with his doctrine of creative synthesis. Wundt was not as simplistic as some critics made him sound. But Gestalt psychologists placed the whole at the center of their system. They argued that organization is not something added after sensation. Organization is basic to experience. That made Gestalt psychology a direct challenge to structuralism, associationism, and behaviorism. Part 14. Phenomenology, Physics, and Gestalt Thinking. Gestalt psychology was influenced by several intellectual currents. One was phenomenology, a movement in German philosophy and psychology. Phenomenology emphasized unbiased description of immediate experience just as it occurs. The goal was not to reduce experience to elements or artificially abstract it. It was closer to common sense experience than to the reports of highly trained introspectors. This helped support the Gestalt focus on experience as organized and whole. Another major influence was the zeitgeist in physics. By the late 19th century, physics itself was becoming less atomistic. Physicists were increasingly interested in fields of force. A field of force is a region or space crossed by lines of force, such as those surrounding an electric current or magnet. Magnetism is the classic example. If you place iron filings on paper over a magnet, the filings arrange themselves into a pattern. They are not touching the magnet directly, but they are affected by the magnetic field. The pattern is not just a sum of individual particles acting alone. It reflects the organization of the field. Light and electricity were also being understood in field terms. These force fields were considered new structural entities, not merely summations of individual elements or particles. This mattered for psychology. The atomism that had shaped early psychology was being reconsidered in physics. Physics was moving toward fields and holes. Gestalt psychologists drew support from this shift. Once again, psychology was influenced by the natural sciences. Psychologists were trying to align their theories with the most advanced scientific models of the time. There was also a personal connection. Köhler had studied with Max Planck, one of the architects of modern physics. Because of Planck's influence, Köhler saw a connection between field physics and Gestalt holes. He saw physics moving away from atoms alone and toward larger field concepts. Gestalt psychology reflected that same shift. Part 15. The Phi Phenomenon. Gestalt psychology grew out of a research study conducted in 1910 by Max Wertheimer. While riding on a train through Germany during vacation, Wertheimer had an idea for an experiment about seeing motion when no motion actually occurs. That is a very psychologist vacation. He used a tachistoscope, an instrument that presents visual stimuli for controlled durations. He projected light through two slits. One slit was vertical. The other was about 20 or 30 degrees away from vertical. When light was shown first through one slit and then the other with a relatively long interval, more than about 200 milliseconds, subjects saw two successive lights. First one, then the other. When the interval was very short, subjects saw what seemed like two lights on continuously. But with an optimal interval of about 60 milliseconds, subjects saw something different, a single line of light that appeared to move from one slit to the other and back again. This was apparent motion. There was no actual movement, but the observer experienced movement. Wertheimer called this the Phi phenomenon. The Phi phenomenon was crucial because it could not be reduced to simple sensations. The experience of motion was not present in either light alone. It emerged from the relationship between them. No matter how carefully observers introspected, the experience of a single moving line persisted. Further analysis failed. The whole experience, apparent movement, was different from the sum of its parts, two stationary lights. This was a direct challenge to elementistic and associationistic psychology. The challenge could not easily be answered. Part 16. Gestalt Contributions to Perception and Learning. Gestalt psychology also contributed to the study of learning and problem solving. Wolfgang Köhler conducted famous studies with chimpanzees, including a chimp named Sultan. In one problem, food such as a banana was suspended overhead, and the animal had to figure out how to reach it. Sultan eventually solved the problem by using boxes. Köhler interpreted this as evidence of insight. Insight means the apparently spontaneous understanding of relationships. Köhler used the German word Einsicht, which translates as insight or understanding. He argued that Sultan did not simply learn by gradual conditioning. Instead, at a certain point, the animal seemed to understand the relationship among the boxes, the body, and the banana. Once the relationship was grasped, the behavior became organized and effective. Köhler wrote that there was no underlying conditioning taking place. Rather, from a certain point on, the animal realized what the situation was about, and from that moment, the behavior was perfect. Interestingly, this was another example of independent or simultaneous discovery. The American animal psychologist Robert Yerkes found evidence in orangutans supporting a concept he called ideational learning, which resembled insight. But not everyone agreed with Köhler. In the 1930s, even Pavlov replicated some of Köhler's studies, in which apes had to stack boxes to reach food. Pavlov found that it took the animals months to solve the problem. He questioned Köhler's claim that the apes had insight and described their problem-solving behavior as chaotic. Pavlov thought their responses were not so different from Thorndike's trial-and-error learning. Köhler disagreed. He criticized Thorndike's puzzle box experiments, arguing that their artificial conditions allowed animals to display only random behaviors. In Thorndike's puzzle boxes, the cats could not see the full release mechanism. They could not survey the entire situation, so they could only make trial-and-error responses. Similarly, an animal in a maze can see only one alley at a time, not the overall design. From the Gestalt perspective, insight requires the organism to perceive the relationships among the parts of the problem. If the whole situation is not available, insight learning becomes difficult or impossible. That is the Gestalt point. Learning involves organization. Problem solving involves seeing relationships. Behavior is molar, not merely molecular. Part 17. Productive Thinking. Gestalt psychology also influenced the study of human thinking. Wertheimer's book Productive Thinking, published after his death, applied Gestalt principles to creative thought. He argued that thinking occurs in terms of wholes. The learner understands the total situation. The teacher should present the situation as a whole. This differs from trial and error methods, where the solution is hidden and the learner may stumble through mistakes before finding the correct answer. Wertheimer believed that details should be considered only in relation to the total situation. Problem solving should proceed from the whole problem down to the parts, not from isolated parts upward. This is very different from strict behaviorism. Behaviorism often emphasized responses, reinforcement, and habit formation. Gestalt psychology emphasized organization, restructuring, relationships, and meaningful wholes. And this points forward to cognitive psychology, because cognitive psychology will also treat perception, memory, problem solving, and learning as organized mental activity. Part 18. Kurt Lewin and the Gestaltish Social World. Now we come to Kurt Lewin. In psychology today, the term field theory is often associated with Lewin. Lewin's work was Gestalt in orientation, but it moved beyond traditional Gestalt psychology. He applied Gestalt-like ideas to human needs, personality, motivation, and social influences on behavior. Lewin proposed a basic state of balance or equilibrium between the person and the environment. When that equilibrium is disturbed, tension arises. That tension leads to action aimed at reducing the tension and restoring balance. So for Lewin, human motivation involves a cycle: need state, tension, activity, relief. This is a dynamic view of human behavior. Lewin's ideas were supported by research such as the work of Bloema-Zygarnik. Zygarnik found that people remembered uncompleted tasks better than completed tasks. This became known as the Zygarnik effect. The basic idea is that unfinished tasks create tension. That tension keeps the task psychologically active. Once the task is completed, the tension is relieved, and the task is less likely to remain mentally active. This is another example of Gestalt-inspired thinking, moving into motivation, memory, and social psychology. The person and environment form a psychological field. Behavior depends on the structure of that field. Part 19. Criticisms of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology was influential, but it was also criticized. One criticism was that Gestalt psychologists sometimes treated organization as something to be accepted rather than explained scientifically. For example, critics argued that phenomena like the phi phenomenon were described but not fully explained. To critics, this seemed like denying that there was a problem to solve. Other experimental psychologists argued that Gestalt concepts were vague and not defined rigorously enough to be scientifically meaningful. Gestalt psychologists responded that young sciences often begin with incomplete explanations. Being incomplete, they argued, is not the same as being vague. Other critics said Gestalt psychologists were too occupied with theory and not focused enough on research and empirical data. Gestalt psychologists rejected that criticism too. They pointed out that their work did include experimentation and a substantial body of research. Another criticism was that Gestalt experimental work was inferior to behaviorist research because it often lacked the same level of control and quantification. The data were sometimes less amenable to statistical analysis. Gestalt psychologists responded that qualitative results were central to their system. Much of their work was exploratory, investigating psychological problems within a different framework. Kohler's concept of insight has also been questioned. Attempts to replicate the two-stick problem with chimpanzees have provided limited support for sudden insight. Later studies suggested that problem solving may not occur as suddenly as Kohler proposed and may depend more on prior learning and experience. Some psychologists also criticized Gestalt psychologists for using poorly defined physiological assumptions. Gestalt researchers admitted that some of their physiological theorizing was tentative, but they believed it was still a useful part of their system. So, Gestalt psychology was not immune to criticism, but it made a crucial contribution. It forced psychology to take organization seriously. It challenged the idea that perception, thought, and learning could be fully understood by breaking them into isolated elements or response chains. Part 20. Why this episode points toward cognitive psychology. Now let's step back. This episode is doing a lot of historical work. It shows that cognitive psychology does not arrive from nowhere. It inherits multiple traditions. From behaviorism, cognitive psychology inherits an insistence on careful methods and observable evidence. From Tolman, it inherits the idea that internal organization can be inferred from behavior if those internal variables are operationally defined. From social learning theory, it inherits attention to expectations, observation, interpretation, and learning from others. From Gestalt psychology, it inherits the focus on perception, organization, insight, problem solving, and meaningful wholes. By the end of this story, psychology is no longer satisfied with behavior alone, but it also cannot simply return to armchair speculation. The field has learned too much from behaviorism about evidence, operational definitions, controlled methods, and observable data. So, cognitive psychology becomes possible because it tries to study the mind scientifically, not as a mystery box, not as something to ignore, but as a system that can be tested through behavior, reaction time, errors, memory, attention, perception, and problem solving. That is the historical bridge. Behaviorism tried to remove the mind. Gestalt psychology insisted that organization matters. Social learning theory brought cognitive variables back into learning. And cognitive psychology eventually says, fine, let's study the mind, but let's do it with data. Wrap up. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Tolman matters, Hull matters, Skinner matters, Bandura matters, Rotter matters, Wertheimer matters, Kohler matters, Lewin matters, Zeigarnik matters, but the pattern matters more. Each figure or school is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. Watson made psychology more objective, but his behaviorism was too narrow. Tolman brought purpose, goals, and intervening variables into behaviorism. Hull tried to make behaviorism mathematically precise. Skinner built a powerful science of operant behavior and reinforcement. Bandura and Rotter brought cognitive processes back through social learning. Gestalt psychologists rejected elementism and argued that perception, learning, and thinking must be understood as organized wholes. And together, these movements prepare psychology for the cognitive revolution. That is the arc. Psychology keeps trying to become more scientific, but every time it narrows itself too much, a new movement appears and says, "You forgot something important." That's our episode for today. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never trust a theory that refuses to explain its origin story. This is Dr. Jackal, signing off.